Hello. Today I'd like to take a look at something I'm entitling Narcissist Bashing is in Vogue and often done by other narcissists themselves. Well, I would start off by saying that I'm not really very happy or enamored by the term narcissist because it has such a toxic feel to it, I think. For consider, who would like to be called either a narcissist or, let's say, a sociopath, amongst a few other words bandied about? Well, I would say then that one of the problems is we don't really have words other than narcissist to describe someone that I would term somebody who thinks they're number one and has some way of trying to justify it so. And secondly, that this same person conveys this perception of themselves to others in a way that makes others feel much less, and thus destroying or lowering the person's self-esteem on the other end. I think both aspects are crucial components to be called a narcissist. Feeling number one and conveying this in a fashion to put others down and lower their self-esteem. You have to have both, not just the first part. And then I would go on to say that I had a good friend, very close friend, a couple years ago. She was 80 at the time, and an artist who had studied art at a notable graduate level school in New Mexico. And we got talking one day, and we talked about, quote, narcissism. And her perspective at that day was that we're all narcissists, and it's only a matter of degree. And I remind myself of what a psychologist once told me, that so many of our traits are on a continuum, not a black and white, all or nothing, polar opposite thing. So I would say, first of all, that the so-called narcissist is a term, an all-or-nothing term, and it doesn't even describe continuum basis, how much narcissism in a person. I would say, that there's no such thing as a maximal narcissist or no narcissism at all in most people. So even the term is a black and white term, and I would say we're all on a continuum in all sorts of difficult traits we have, and being number one and perhaps putting others down at the same time is something many of us, or most of us, may have on a continuum. And so the whole concept itself of narcissism is suspicious. Just as in my mind the whole concept of mental illness too is suspicious, because it too says you're just one thing or the other. You're dealing with some kind of maladies to the max, or you're perfect. Polar opposites, basically, one or the other, plus or minus, 1 or 0, when in fact we're all on a continuum. And so, interestingly, this friend of mine who was 80 once secured a separation from her husband. His being a Catholic, but she not, they settled on a separation rather than a divorce. Her comment to me at that point was, or several years ago, was that he was so into himself. In other words, perhaps very egocentric, but perhaps also thinking himself number one. Now, I'm not sure he put others down, though, as a second or third point on all of this. But ironically then, looking back now several years later, I would say that she too was a quote narcissist of some proportion too. How interesting then for a narcissist of perhaps lower quality or content to criticize another narcissist who is simply further along to the more difficult end of that spectrum. And finally, on all of this, I would say that I have viewed 2 or 3 either psychologists or practitioners who specialize in narcissism. And all 3 of them, in my opinion, did not look to me to be free of this trait themselves. Perhaps they had in fact been in relationships where they struggled with this so-called narcissistic partner, felt very hurt, got out of the relationship, and decided to specialize in this trait the other partner had, and totally then failed to examine themselves very much as to having the same trait, only perhaps to a lesser extent. And so how interesting, I think, for practitioners to have a specialty in even to the extent of what I call bashing narcissists when they have the same trait themselves but are somewhat blind to this, having it perhaps to a lesser extent, simply trying to understand where their relationship perhaps went wrong. Now, interestingly, one practitioner or more who specialize in, quote, narcissism has urged people they consider to be victims of narcissism to tell themselves it's not you, it's them. In other words, with respect to the topic of gaslighting, if a narcissist tells you things about yourself you deem not to be true and call it gaslighting, to simply remind yourself, it's not me, it's them. But then there's the fallacy, isn't it, that I've been talking about, that nothing is all or nothing, and often the people we criticize, we have the same trait that they do, perhaps only to a lesser extent. Or maybe we're completely blind and have the same level of extent. Again, a fascinating issue. I'm reminded too of a instance where my mother was in a car accident once, and I believe, if memory serves me right, the officer who came to the scene, or someone later, assessed not blame to just one partner, but both partners, perhaps 80% to one liability and 20% to the other. So extending this to the concept of, quote, narcissism, isn't it interesting then to hear someone say, oh, they're a narcissist and I'm not, when again, even in car accidents, often there is not a clear-cut 100% fault on one party's activity and 0% on the other. Now, this is not, of course, to say that in relationship difficulties, sometimes leading to divorce or separation, that one partner may not have the lion's share of the problems in that relationship, whether issues of violence or disagreements on finances and how money is spent or enjoyed, or sexual activity differences in perspective. There's, in my opinion, never a total 100% fault in one partner and 0% on the other. But that, of course, doesn't mean that, for instance, there may be a 80 or 90% fault if, say, one partner is violent and the other isn't. And so I'm going to migrate then on to the next concept I see talked of by some so-called narcissist experts, whereby they tend to say that loving the partner in a relationship who is, quote, the narcissist and the problem will not help, or rarely help. But how interesting to come out of the mouth of somebody who I often perceive is not very loving themselves and has little love to offer. So how can they even say such a thing then, that love will not transform or help a partner who is, quote, a narcissist, if they themselves have only a modicum of love to offer? In fact, I'm reminded of Erich Fromm, the famous psychoanalyst perhaps in the 1980s, who wrote the book The Art of Loving. And he said words to the effect that most people have never even met someone their whole lives who can love them. And of course he's putting love on a continuum, or an all or nothing basis than a continuum, but still, I think there's some truth to that, especially in this day and age of high technology and massive drug use and many other issues. But at any rate, how interesting then for me to bring up a couple examples of people I think were a real cut above in the love department, and it showed, and it was transformative. And first, Mahatma Gandhi, who started small in South Africa with campaigns, and 30 or 40 years later brought the British, quote, to their knees. The most massive empire on earth at that time. And while many say he did this through, quote, nonviolence, his own package of, quote, nonviolent activity, my perspective is that it went farther than that. It went to the love department. It went to what I would in fact define as 80 or 90% of love being acceptance and respect, basically. I see Gandhi as perhaps one of very few people who could have done that or did do that. Another person who many would never consider, perhaps, myself included, to a year or two ago, seeing a YouTube video, is Anton Chekhov, a famous Russian writer, who was reputed in one video to have stuck with a family of very, very difficult, challenged people emotionally, family members, basically. And while I don't have details, you could probably say most of them were, quote, narcissists. And how interesting that most, quote, narcissistic experts would just say, write them off, go no contact or minimal contact, and deem these people to be toxic people and get them out of your life. But Chekhov didn't do that, apparently. A video said he stuck with them. And later in the video it said this was transformative to the people of the family. Transformative. Now, for some reason then, Chekhov, in my mind, was able to do what many people cannot. A third example comes to mind of Johnny Cash. And he had some repute in his time for having given at least several concerts to prisoners in penitentiaries, notably Folsom Prison, with, quote, murderers there for life perhaps. And while many people who were prisoners in many situations would have regarded an entertainer as an elitist and perhaps heckled the person, especially if they demonstrated a certain amount of money in their pockets, so to speak. But this did not happen to Johnny Cash from the prisoners. Instead, Johnny Cash, having been arrested 6 or 7 times himself, but never having gone to prison, he understood them very well, including the murderers, and it translated to understanding, acceptance, love, and respect, all part of the same ball of wax, I'd say. And this was quite apparent in probably 1 or 2 minutes to the even the most incorrigible prisoners there. And wouldn't you know, they loved him to death, and the word spread on the grapevine, Johnny Cash is okay. Well, you could say, he understands us. He loves us when most don't. And of course, he never said, and anyone else ever said, that they had, amongst other flaws, a big narcissistic component, if you want to use that word. But love in this instance, being, in my opinion, rather rare to that extent, was very transformative, at least to the point where the prisoners loved him to death when they probably would not have said as much to any extent of any other entertainer ever to come. Finally, I would digress to Gandhi again and say that a book I read on him several years ago said that British senior officials used to warn underling British officials, don't go near Gandhi, because he'll get to you. In other words, the love component, the acceptance component, the respect component of Gandhi would be very apparent to almost all British officials, including the underlings, with perhaps less to lose. And he would often convert them, perhaps, if in contact with them for more than a few minutes. And so I'm reminded of Nehru, a senior Indian official, once a British official who Gandhi got to with his, quote, attitude. But again, the, quote, narcissistic experts would tend to say love has no effect on a narcissist and it'll bounce right off them. Don't give people love. Don't give narcissists love. Just call them toxic and write them off. And I would say, well, perhaps in many cases that might be true if one cannot muster understanding toward people one finds quite irritable. So it's up to each individual, then I would say, to estimate where they fall on the spectrum of understanding what some would call toxic people. Nobody can be Superman or Superwoman, of course. Now, even in South Africa, in Gandhi's earlier days, there was a General Smuts who was very antagonistic, you might call an enemy of sorts, toward Gandhi. For some time, perhaps years, but Gandhi got to him too. And again, reading of Gandhi and his life, it's very fascinating to note in the book that in the end, General Smuts and Gandhi were friends. I'm not going to say best pals, but Gandhi's, quote, love or acceptance got to even General Smuts. Now, where I see it not much discussed from circles containing, quote, narcissist experts, whether a PhD holding or MD holding, or perhaps those who simply had a very difficult relationship and then decided to specialize in this, I see over and over emphasis on it's not you, it's them, and also I'm reminded of the words of Socrates to know yourself, know thyself. Well, I find that a fascinating topic, and perhaps one could theoretically know that the lion's share of problems in a relationship might in fact be someone else's fault. But here is my perspective now at age 60, and that is that perhaps it's not so easy at any point in time to do what Socrates said, and that is know thyself. And here's why, in my opinion, that perhaps we can't ever know ourselves completely and ever come to the point of being sure, to a large extent, of who we are. We're always urged, for instance, to assess ourselves, our assets and liabilities. While that might be possible in many cases if you're, quote, above average in honesty and have a lot of time and perhaps are a writer, still, I find myself having experienced the reality of even massive quantities of effort on assessing strengths and weaknesses to be problematic in one respect, that we can all have blind spots. In other words, we can all think and perhaps know most of our assets and liabilities except for one or two. And wouldn't it be interesting if this one or two assets or liabilities we don't know about is, in fact, narcissism in ourselves? And I say this from personal experience because I concluded half a year ago that I too was a narcissist, and never would have dreamt it till age 59 or 60. But of course on a continuum, not a flaming narcissist. Simply one who thought he was number one because of a certain trait he thought so superlative, but I was ignoring personally a big flaw, a big lacuna, if you will, that I never saw till age 59 or 60. And so to know all my assets and liabilities except this one really was incomplete. And I would say then that from this experience I will go to my grave being rather unsure that 5 or 10 years after each 5 or 10 years worth, that I might just discover a new flaw I never knew existed in me. Maybe not narcissism to some extent, but some other flaw. So I hate to say perhaps we should re-examine the words of Socrates, to know thyself as though it's possible completely, but perhaps we should challenge this concept. Perhaps it's impossible to do that completely, and know that in 5 or 10 years we might discover something we never dreamt we had as a flaw. And so the upshot then, I would say, is it's impossible to say, in my opinion, that a relationship problem is all one's spouse's or lover's fault or friend's fault and nothing of ours. And to say perhaps further that the relationship problem is because someone else is a narcissist and we're not. Because how can we say this if we don't know who we are in all respects, including narcissism? Not to say we're all at one spectrum end, but that we can have a significant amount of some flaw and not know it. And so then to summarize, I had entitled the talk here something of the lines of narcissist bashing. And I guess I say that because I think we should probably, myself included, not bash anyone, or, in other words, heavily criticize or castigate someone for some flaw if we may in fact have the same flaw that they do, only perhaps to a lesser extent, and not know it. Perhaps not till 5 or 10 years later, or even up to the point that we're ending our lives, so to speak. So I guess I'm saying and musing that the whole concept of narcissism is not an all or nothing thing, and that I personally have difficulty placing a relationship problem solely on someone else's shoulders entirely, especially if we were to call them a narcissist and ourselves not. I would kind of call that bashing then. And in closing too, I would just kind of summarize and say too that relationships are hard. And perhaps many, quote, narcissist experts are no longer in any relationships, oftentimes, and may only have been in one several years, not stuck it out long enough to see any kind of resolution coming about or improvement in situations, including growth on both partners' playing field or personality. So I guess I'm saying I urge myself some caution here in criticizing others and assuming everything is someone else's fault. I wish you well and hope this is of some interest to you and helpfulness. Again, I wish you well.